Well, as you can see, this is yet another of those videos I make while I'm at work that I will not upload until I am done with work, which doesn't make any sense to say, but I think we'll still be a week or two away. But anyway, while I'm at work, I usually do have ample opportunities to read, and this is a section of the well where we really don't do very much work, and I do a lot of reading. So I have been reading this book, Failure of the New Economics, The Refutation of Keynes by Henry Hazlitt, and also this book, which is kind of autobiographical. Now, Hazlitt is first and foremost a writer. He made his living writing for many decades, and also, although not formally trained, he's a brilliant man, and he studied economics for a long time and is extremely well read. Not just in the Austrian school. When you read this book, he frequently will quote, Marshall and Fisher and Pigou and Wittgenstein and Casal and just everybody. He'll quote Mises, obviously, and Hayek too, but very well read. But and I remember the only other book I've read of his is Economics in One Lesson, which is probably his most popular book by far. I'm told it's the most popular economics book ever written, other than like a textbook. And I really think Venus Project people would do well to read him, because most of the fallacious things they say are kind of addressed in his books. But anyway, while I was reading it, he obviously talks about Keynes, and it's clear his take on it, and I'm going to just accept it from what I can tell. He extensively quotes Keynes in this book. It's pretty fair, I would say, and although I'd have to read the general theory first to be certain, but clearly Keynes thought that whatever causes problems in the economy, it can possibly be minimum wages. So if there's any kind of economic downturn, it can't be because wages are fixed. Even though many of the arguments he makes would implicitly require this, he doesn't. He actually explicitly says that can't be the reason. And minimum wage is one of those sacrosanct things among many on the left and even some on the right, and it really bugs me to no end, because it's so unbelievably conceited. Now, we all know that raising the price on something, as long as demand doesn't change, is going to mean that you're going to have an unsold surplus, and in the case true for steel or copper or toothpicks, and also for labor. That doesn't really bug me so much as just the unbelievable hubris of liberals. It'd be kind of like if somebody said, well, I really like baseball and I would like to play on a team, and someone comes along and says, well, that's great that you have a dream, you want to play on a baseball team, but it would be demeaning to you if you played on just some regular amateur team where there aren't big crowds and there aren't the best players, and so we're going to make it so that the only baseball teams anyone's allowed to play on are major league teams. Now, there's a certain logic to that. It's true that if you play in the smaller leagues, you won't have the bigger audiences, and you won't have the most competitive atmosphere, and you won't have the most fulfilling experience, at least if you accept certain preconditions on what is a meaningful experience in a baseball game. But the result would be that almost nobody is good enough or has the time to become good enough, even if they might naturally have the ability to ever get onto a Major League Baseball team. And so the effect of this well-meaning dictate is that the vast majority of people who would like to play baseball simply can't. Because if you say you're not allowed to play on smaller teams because it's demeaning, then only the very best players will ever be able to play on a team. And furthermore, consumers of baseball will then be restricted. So if you want to go to a baseball game, you now will have the only option will be to go to a Major League one. can't even settle for a minor league game or a little league game or a high school varsity game or any number or a college game. And this is unbelievably conceited, and it's the same thing for labor. They say you shouldn't be able to work for less than quote-unquote a living wage, but who are they to say what that even is? Who are they to say what your values are, what your circumstances are? It's very easy to make hypothetical situations that aren't even lifeboat situations, but are actually practical, real-world examples where people might prefer to work for less rather than nothing. And I mean, it's usually the case. It's usually better to have more options than not. And to say you're only allowed to work if you can make a certain amount is grossly unfair. That denies that person opportunities. Now, I know a lot of people, not a lot, but I've known people who live fairly frugally. They've never had high incomes, but they haven't spent more than they've made. And they're in a position now where they don't have any debt. They have a house, they have a car, and they don't consume that much, and so they don't need a huge income. They need a relatively small income, and they can use that, and part of it goes to feed themselves, and the rest of it is basically theirs to play with. And who's to say that that's insufficient or not good enough? Nobody has the moral authority to say that. The other aspect, of course, is personally, as somebody who has certainly had his fair share of uncertainty in future employment, not just in this job, but in previous ones. And I've worked at a couple places that went out of business. All of them that I worked at went out of business after I left, but they could have gone out when I was there. In situations where you need an income, where you need an income stream, to be told that you have to work at a place that pays so much is denying you the possibility of something less, which would be more certain. If there was no minimum wage, it would be literally impossible to have involuntary unemployment. We'll never get to a position where there'll be no unemployment. Why? Because, quite frankly, there are some people who don't need to work because they're wealthy enough, or some people who, even if they're not wealthy, just don't want to work because they're content living on the dole or on very, very little means, or in their parents' basement, or any number of other reasons. Or people who are unemployed because they're just seeking a new job and they want to be unemployed for a while where they look for it. I mean, I've had relatives who lost their job, and rather than just run off and get something, they decided to wait for a while until they could find the perfect job. And there's no sense in decrying that as, unemployment, but there are people who want jobs, who would be willing to take anything, and they're denied this opportunity because of minimum wage. And an anecdote I like to use is when I worked at Burger King for many years. When I was in college, we had a homeless lady who would come into our store several times a week. Somehow she got her hands on a huge bundle of coupons that said a free small fry. And she would come in and she would get a free small fry, and we'd give her a water glass that she'd invariably fill with something other than water. And this lady, every time she came in, would ask for an application. And I don't think she necessarily handed them all in, but she would fill them out and hand them in. But this lady was homeless. She couldn't bathe. She stank. She was not very intelligent. She was not very productive, you could tell. She was mildly lame. I mean, she had a pronounced limp. And there is no way in hell that she could have done anything to pay the minimum wage, which in that time there was a federal minimum wage, but there was a municipal minimum wage that I believe was like $7.25, which I think the minimum wage federally is more than that now, but back then it wasn't. And there was nothing she could do that was worth $7.25, so it would be a loss. The business would be losing money. It would be an act of charity, which actually, the managers, they're humane people. They feel for this woman, but they can't make the rest of us become unemployed because they hired this one lady. But if they could have paid her less, then all of a sudden it becomes something that is plausible, because they could have said, listen, can't pay you $7.50, but we can pay you a few dollars, and maybe come in once a day and say sweep our parking lot and maybe take out the trash, and we'll pay you a little money and we'll give you a meal. Uh, and she could have either said no or yes. And if she said yes, I don't think anybody who would intercede to prevent this from occurring would be in the moral high ground. In fact, they would be an aggressive, antisocial bigot for doing so. And this could have been a very mutually beneficial arrangement. I know for me, I had certain skills that are highly valued at a fast food restaurant. I was always very good at running the drive-thru, which is usually one of the most stressful and difficult jobs at a fast food place. Usually, most of the ones I worked at, I'd say only 10% of the employees could even do it at all, and there are usually only 2 or 3 who were considered so competent that they would only ever do that. And that's what always ended up happening to me, is I would only do drive-thru. Once they figured out I knew how to do it, they would assign me to that, and that's basically what I did for 12 hours a day for 7 years, it seems like. And yet there were circumstances where they would have to pay me to go out and sweep the parking lot because they want the parking lot to be clean, and there'll be, you know, paper cups and whatever, you know, just miscellaneous trash. But they could have paid this lady to do it, and she could have done it and what happened with me is that since it cost so much, and it wasn't just me, but everybody else, it was a way. You're spending way too much to have somebody go and do a task like that, and so what would happen is that it wouldn't get done nearly as much as it was. So the parking lot at this store, it wasn't like a pigsty, but like it was never immaculate, and it's supposed to be immaculate. You'd want it to be immaculate, and it would have been immaculate if there hadn't been a minimum wage law. And this lady, I'm positive, was putting in apps where I was just a row where there was restaurant, 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 restaurant for a mile almost, or in other businesses. She could easily have been making $2 an hour at a dozen of them. And that doesn't mean she's suddenly going to live in a really nice apartment, but that she's going to have an income, and she's going to have a full belly, and she'll have. And then what happens is that, like, what's his name? I want to say Robert Williams. Would say it's the bottom rung of the ladder. They wouldn't hire her at $5 or $6 an hour, but they'll hire her maybe at $2. But if she does well, in a few weeks or even a few months, perhaps even a few days, they might say, well, hey, why don't you, instead of just doing the driveway, why don't you come in once a night, once we close the doors, and you can clean the dining room? Which is, again, was another task that I would end up doing quite a bit. And it was a difficult task. It's one of those things you have to do every night. It's not particularly difficult, but it takes, what, an hour and a half, 2 hours. And it's difficult kind of to juggle that when you have all of your employees strategically placed to you know, serve the drive-through customer, because usually the drive-through would still be open when that was. I know this analogy is maybe a little. This is an analogy. This is a real thing, but this is maybe a little too industry specific. But that's how. When someone gets a minimum wage, you're not saying that they're now only ever going to get that minimum wage. That means it's the first step, and whether they take the next one or not is up to them and their employers. I mean, they could be the best. They could do a really good job, and the business could still go out of business, and then they'd be back. They'd be back. But if there's no minimum wage, it's not going to be hard to get a second job at all, if wages can fluctuate. And wages should be able to fluctuate. And again, it's this weird hypocrisy of liberals. I think it stems from a dogmatic insistence to arbitrarily separate, personal, private freedoms with economic ones. So you can be free to have sex with anybody you want for free, but you can't do it for money, or you can't work. I mean, the evangelical Christian conservative John Mangopoulos, who I used to watch, would say, liberals say that you can consent to having sex with a prostitute, but you can't consent to working for $4 an hour. And he's correct. That's the liberal position. They don't all favor prostitution, but they would favor consensual non-prostitutional sex. And isn't that like a bigger deal than working for $2 an hour or less or whatever? So the hubris and the conceit of liberals in this area and in all others basically, but this one is what I'm talking about here, just bother, and it's ironic because these are the people who wear on their sleeve how much for the little guy they are, but they will do everything in their power to keep the little guy on the dole forever. And as far as the Democratic parties before, I do believe that at least at some levels this is deliberate. I remember talking to one of my right-wing friends, and he said, the liberals would hate to have black people become wealthy, because if they were, they'd have no reason to vote for Democrats. However, outside the party, I don't believe this is what's going on in the mind of your average Occupy Wall Street person. They think that they're being a do-gooder, when really they're devastating the world, and the people they hurt the most are those with the least skills. I mean, if you're a high-end, highly skilled, highly trained worker, the minimum wage laws hover far below even your opportunity cost. So even your third or fourth best job is far above it, and it has little effect on you other than the fact that you probably pay a little bit higher prices for certain goods. If you're poor and you don't have high skills, so this would especially include people who are homeless, or who are drug addicts, or who are alcoholics, or who are very young children, these people are hurt the most. I mean, without clearly, and this lame homeless woman, she was hurt far more by minimum wage laws than I was. Although that same restaurant that I worked at a couple of different Burger Kings over the year, but the one where she used to come in, the municipality actually raised the minimum wage after I left, about 2 months after I left, and the new minimum wage was high enough that they had to close. And the majority of the workers there were a few who were college students who were probably, it wasn't that big a deal, but there were many, many lower class, a lot of immigrants, a lot of people from Africa and China and Mexico, and they all became unemployed. And I'm sure most of them were able to find new jobs, but thank you, the municipality, for your graciousness in destroying a business and a job, and of course whatever services we provided to people, because of your well-meaningness, which is superfluous and destructive and evil and conceited.